today's gospel reading, Mark presents an interesting take on the story of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. And when you read that gospel and you combine it with what we've learned in Sunday school and what we've learned in church and what we've learned in countless Hollywood spectacles on the life of Jesus, we see sort of a militaristic, triumphal entry with Jesus arriving to take charge or to lay claim to his city of Jerusalem. And we have Jesus riding in on the back of this donkey who had never been ridden. And there are throngs of people cheering him on, and there are massed shouts of Hosanna coming from the people. Hosanna meaning, Lord, save us. And then, of course, there's the palm fronds that are falling like rain on the streets of Jerusalem. The people throwing their cloaks to Jesus, throwing their cloaks on the street in front of him. Makes it all sound very spectacular. Makes it sound a little like a Tom Jones concert or something. And it makes for a great spectacle. But it gives some scholars today pause. Because if Jesus was such a rebel, and he was, and if Jesus was such a maverick to the church, to the authority of the priests, if he was such a powerful persona in first century Jerusalem, why on earth would the Romans, let alone the high priests, just let him kind of walk into town in this massive parade, rolling into Jerusalem like a patent rolling into Messina? And how would this apparently star-struck crowd, which is so enthralled at the sight of Jesus on Sunday, suddenly turn into a bunch of rabid haters by the end of the week? Those are good questions. The author of Mark, maybe, did the author of Mark frame this event with an eye toward the dramatic irony of a welcomed Messiah who would be crucified in less than a week? Because we know that Jesus used irony in his teaching. But maybe that was what the author tried to put across in his story. Or perhaps when we go back and look at the gospel, do a slightly less breathless and more measured reading of what was actually written, it might take us in a slightly different direction. Maybe even a direction that says something about our relationship with Jesus today. So let's step back and take another look at what Mark told us. We'll start at the beginning. There's certainly a bit of the cloak and dagger about how the disciples went about finding this donkey for Jesus. Remember, they were given instructions to go into the village. It's not clear, but it was probably either Bethphage or Bethany. So the disciples just go into this town, and Jesus tells them, you'll find a mule, or a donkey rather, that's never been ridden. It'll be the first one you come to. You can't miss it. When you come to this donkey, just go up and untie it and bring it to me. So the disciples then are instructed, in so many words almost, to basically go into this village and steal a donkey. That's what it sounds like anyway. But given who Jesus is, we're pretty sure that he did not instruct them to go hijack a donkey. So we know that there's something going on in the background that we're not being told, that maybe is just meant to be assumed by the reader. Or maybe the author of Mark was deliberately trying to keep things a little vague. But it seems likely, at least, that given the unpopularity of Jesus with certain people, and these would be certain people with whom being unpopular can get you dead. Small wonder maybe that the owner of that particular donkey wanted to keep Jesus at arm's length. He wanted to help, but he didn't want to be seen helping Jesus. So we can imagine that the arrangement then was, I'll leave the donkey here, I'll walk away, and if one of you guys should happen to come up and take it, that's on you, it's not on me. So given that, it gives us a little clue as to maybe what was happening the rest of this time. And far from being a coincidence, the use of this donkey was carefully crafted by Jesus to recall Old Testament imagery. He was doing it very much on purpose to remind the people of their heritage and to spark in them the idea that, oh, this king is going to arrive this particular way. When this guy arrives riding a donkey that's never been ridden, that's a sign to us. So Jesus planned that part too. And it may be that the description that Mark has is of a somewhat more low-key event, and not really like the Macy's Day Parade, but something a little less spectacular, but just as important. Because in the Gospel, after all, Mark is sort of indistinct. He just says, many people waved palms. Many people threw their cloaks down on the ground. Out of all that crowd, how many is many? And those who went before and after the procession announcing Jesus could just as easily have been his disciples as members of the crowd. To put this in context, Jerusalem during the week before Passover was pretty much a circus. Because there were 100,000 people coming into town. It was doubling its population for that one week. It was the early version of spring break. You had 100,000 people pouring into this town. Some of them were there to worship. Some of them were there to people watch. No doubt some of them were there to take advantage of the other people that were there. But you had 100,000 people over the course of a few days streaming into Jerusalem, coming in through all of the gates. So Palm Sunday, what we think of as a Palm Sunday procession happening at one gate at one particular time, may have been locally spectacular. It was certainly important. But it may not have been quite the image that we get when we think of Hollywood. And it certainly explains how Jesus could have kind of come in under the radar of the authorities. Because even a hoopla like Mark presents, when you have so many tens of thousands of people coming into town, could easily be missed by the Romans. The importance of this event, the importance of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, doesn't come from its scale or its perceived scale. The importance comes from the content of the event. It comes from the Old Testament imagery that is consciously being tapped by Jesus. It's an event that was meant, in the end, to be looked at by people looking back. It was an event that Jesus meant for people to be able to look back at, and after the death and resurrection, that they could look back and say, oh, he's the one that rode in on the donkey. That has to be the king. How could we have missed it? Because obviously it didn't do anything to make him more secure, because he still ended up dead. hanging from a cross. But it definitely set up a reference point, a point in time for the people who, after the resurrection, could go back and say, this is when we found out, this is when we knew, this is when he showed us for sure he was the Messiah, that he was the King that we've been expecting. It gave people a solid marker to hold on to and say, yeah, that's exactly what happened. And it gave his disciples a place to point to, or a time to point to, and say, this is when he showed himself to be who he was. So we see that the entry into Jerusalem was a masterstroke on the part of Jesus to establish his credentials one more time for the Passion. And recognizing that it was deliberately done does not take away from its importance. It does not take away from what Jesus was trying to do. It just shows us that it was that Jesus was very consciously choosing to do everything that week to help us understand what he was doing, to help us understand who he was and why he was here. And it points to the fact that Jesus, far from being just a humble country preacher come to meet his fate in the big city, was something much, much more than that. He planned everything carefully to get his message across, because his message was so important to everybody on earth that he had to do everything he could to make us understand. And it came down to even details like, well, how should I arrive in town? Should I just slip in? Go to the hotel, check in? Or maybe I should ride on a donkey. It's never been ridden. And announce myself as king. So we can see the importance of this event and understand that it wasn't a spontaneous event so much as it was a carefully planned outreach effort on the part of Jesus. And we can appreciate it for what it meant then, what Jesus was trying to say and to show about his ministry. But it leaves us now with a question. As carefully managed and planned as this event was, what does it mean to us 2,000 years later? Does it mean anything? Or is it just a historical footnote? Is it a place marker? Well, here's what Jesus did at this particular time. Is it just one more piece in the mosaic that was Jesus' ministry? I think, honestly, in some ways, the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem mirrors our own faith lives. I think the triumphal entry and the subsequent events kind of potentially at least mirror the trajectory of our faith on some level. Now, not everybody experiences faith in the same way. Not everybody has the same experience. Not everybody encounters Jesus or works through their relationship with him in the same way. I want to be clear on that. But I think that this might apply to many of us, at least, at some point in our lives. Because we have stage one, we'll call the triumphal entry the first stage. That's the point where we finally recognize Jesus, just as the people in Jerusalem did. We finally recognize Jesus for what he is. We discover him either on our own or somebody points him out to us, or we learn about him in Sunday school and church. In any case, we get to that point in our life where we say, I get it now. Jesus is here to save us. He's here to save me. And when we're at that point, we're excited because, we're waving the palm fronds then figuratively, and we're jumping up and down, yelling, Jesus, save me. I finally understand that you're there for me. And we are so glad to have him come into our lives that we are just beside ourselves and we're overcome with joy and we're thankful to have him there. Then we get to the next phase. after the parade is gone. After all of that initial excitement of discovery is gone and we're facing a lifetime trying to live with faith now. Find out it can be kind of hard. Sure, we liked what we saw and what we heard and what we discovered at the very beginning. It made us excited. Like that first love. Feeling that just gets to your heart. Makes you sing. We like the glittering idea of a Savior. We like the idea of a Messiah who has reached out to us personally and saved us. Then we discover that if we want to hold on to that Savior, it's going to impact our lives. Sometimes it seems like it might be hard to do. Because we like the idea of what Jesus teaches us, but then we realize that in order to embrace His teachings, that's going to force us to think differently. If we are actually going to be followers of Jesus, then we are going to have to live our lives differently. It's a realization that comes from discovering that we can't just say, okay, I accept Jesus. I accept Jesus. He's in my life. I'm sorry for my sins. That's a first step, and we have to take the next step. And that next step can be confusing. It's not enough to just take that first step, because to be on our journey with Jesus, we have to continue to take steps to follow Him. We have to stop, for instance, judging people. And it can be hard. We have to stop looking at people and say, I love Jesus. Certainly, I know Jesus came to save me. But there are just some people that are beyond saving. There are just some people that it's not worth bothering about. You have to change that way of thinking. Jesus taught, you have to love your neighbor as yourself. Some of us can have pretty unpleasant neighbors. And we see further that Jesus teaches that we actually have to serve our fellow human beings. That means sometimes serving people that we wouldn't necessarily want to jump out and reach out to. But that's what we're expected to do if we're taking those next steps. Being a follower of Jesus, as He has said several times throughout His gospel, means that we turn our backs on being consumed by the things of this world. And that can be a hard pill for us to swallow too. Yes, I love Jesus. Does that mean I have to give up my 60-inch ultra high definition 4K TV? That means you can't love it. It means you can't set that you can't make that an idol. You can't set Jesus to the side and say, I'll get back to you after I get this stuff that I really want. Sometimes we do that. Sometimes we welcome Jesus into our hearts. We welcome Him in that great procession, that parade, and then as He comes by and we realize what Jesus is asking us to do, we kind of think, well, maybe I'll get back to you. We like the idea of what Jesus teaches until we realize that to embrace the teachings, we're going to have to think differently. Being a follower of Jesus is one of those things that just sounds good in the abstract, but in real life it can be a pain. It's a pain in in the buck when you actually ask yourself, what would Jesus do? Because a lot of times when you answer that question accurately and honestly, what Jesus would do is not what you want to do. So then you have a choice of either subsuming your desires to Jesus's, or just saying, okay, well, I know Jesus wants me to do that, but I really want to do this. So I'll just, maybe take a vacation from Jesus for a little bit. Being a disciple of Jesus forces us over time even to reevaluate our social and our political beliefs. I'm not getting into politics. I'm just saying, once you truly accept what Jesus teaches, what He wants you to do, it starts to reorient your thinking about a whole lot of things in this life. Because Jesus was not just teaching empty intellectual lessons. These were not just intellectual and ethical exercises. He was calling upon those who believed in Him to live differently, to think differently. Remember, He calls on us to see Him in the faces of our neighbors when we look at the world around us. Basically says, I'm everywhere. When you're looking at somebody, you're looking at me. How you treat that person is how you're treating me. There are just times when it's inconvenient to do that, to think that way. There are times when it would be far more convenient to forget who we are and who we're called to be as followers of Christ in a broken world. And Jesus recognizes that. Even when we welcome Him one day and we walk away from Him the next, we're always able to walk back to Him. He's always reaching out to us. So if you're at a point in your life where you've maybe fallen away, remember you can always go back. You can always go back to that joyous time when you welcome Jesus back to your life. So on this Palm Sunday, I invite you to think well, welcoming Jesus. If you've welcomed Jesus already, how is that going to affect your life? What is that going to mean for you? What is it even going to mean for the church? How we relate, and how we carry out His mission in this world.